Hi and welcome to Lin's Napoleonic shipyard. On the morning of 2nd of March 1808, in the North Sea near Scarborough, a British 18-gun brig-sloop of the cruiser class called HMS Sappho is on patrol. She has a crew of 120 men and is armed with 16 32-pounder carronades and 2 6-pounder long guns as chase guns. She spots an armed brig steering a course that would take it across the path of several British merchant vessels to leeward. Sappho gives chase, and after a couple of ruses, it turns out that she is flying Danish colors and there is an engagement. The ship is the Admiral Yule and she carries 28 guns, long guns of smaller calibers than the 32-pounder carronades of the Sappho. She has a crew of 83 men and is commanded by the rather famous Jørgen Jørgensen, a Danish adventurer who a year later briefly declared himself King of Iceland, of all things. Crazy. But this morning, in particular, he's commanding a privateer. And he's already taken 8 or 9 British merchant vessels by cutting through the winter ice earlier than anyone expected. As I said, the engagement lasts for 30 minutes and ends with Admiral Yule striking her colors. Casualties were light on both sides, 2 killed on the Danish side. The commander, George Langford of the HMS Sappho, is, as a consequence of this, promoted to post-captain later on. The action is a very typical one of the Napoleonic Wars. Not maybe, if you're not particularly interested, it's something that you normally read because you normally read about these larger battles. It didn't decide anything by itself. It was exactly what the Royal Navy spent most of its time doing between 1793 and 1850 during the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars. And the ship itself, of the cruiser class, was one of nearly 110 identical vessels built to this design. This is the story of those ships, these unrated vessels, and the war they fought. I have touched briefly on this subject in my gun-brig and other videos, but I felt like since I'm right now digging into it myself and found some stuff that are quite interesting, I wanted to make a video for you guys as well, talking more about these different classes of unrated vessels. And to get into this, we're going to have to start looking first at the British rating system. The Royal Navy classified its commissioned warships by a rating system based on the number of carriage guns carried. First rates at this time were 100 guns or more on 3 decks. Second rates, the 90 to 98 gun vessels, and I've mentioned this in an earlier video, were really ungainly brutes, but actually the French 80 guns were even better than them. But one that came up and I want to mention in the comments on that video is the fact that why were they used by admirals and fleet commanders was probably also space. So there was a lot of space for the admiral and his staff on these ships. So that's another reason for them being used, even if they were ungainly. Another fact that actually Drake Evenefeld brought up in his latest video of the ship Le Terrible, one of the first 74s there, is the fact that the 36 pounders that I've talked about on the French ship is actually 36 livres. And livre is slightly more than the pound, so the 36 livre guns is actually something similar to 38 pounders, making those 80-gun French ships, third rates, even heavier. And the third rates themselves, of course, were between 64 and 80 guns. Fourth rates between 48 and 60 guns. A lot of these, the 2-decked ones, were slowly getting phased out at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But of course then these larger frigates with the longer hulls after this diagonal bracing would take over that role. So you would have those large heavy frigates of up to 60 guns in the later wars of the Napoleonic Wars. Of course also those really large vessels. Fifth rates, 32 to 44 guns, the normal frigates. And of course sixth rates being smaller frigates, but also ships known as post ships in the British service. This would be the equivalent probably of the French corvette. But the British didn't have corvettes at this point, or didn't have the name for them at this point, I should say. So these were post ships. By the middle years of the war, the 74-gun third rate had become the dominant British ship of the line, though the 64-gun ships were still numerous in 1793. A first rate such as HMS Victory at Trafalgar carried 104 guns, and the official complement was 821 officers and men, exclusive of supernumeraries. Below the sixth rate, vessels were not included in the formal rating hierarchy at all. They appeared separately in the Navy list under categories such as sloops, brigs, cutters, and bomb vessels, and also gun-brigs. Command of a rated ship conferred posted status, permanent seniority as a post captain. Commanders of unrated vessels held the rank of commander or lieutenant. They had not been posted, as a distinction that materially affected career progression. So everyone strived for, and if you're reading over Matrian series early on, this is the main thing for Jacobi, right? Because once you're posted, if you don't fail or die, you will eventually end up being an admiral of some kind. But this is not the case for these temporary commands, like a commander or a lieutenant. They still have to be posted. Langford's promotion after the Sappo action is a direct illustration of how this worked. The capture of a sufficient significant vessel earned him a step, and that he could not otherwise guarantee. By 1813 and 14, the Royal Navy had over 900 vessels in commission, and many of them were unrated. Of course, these 900 vessels include also unarmed transports and so on. It needs to be mentioned. So the main unrated types were the ship-sloop, which was a three-masted ships. They were not super common, but they were around, and they were fully square-railed on all three masts, and they had up to 20 guns. They were used as independent patrol vessels and so on, and on foreign stations where larger vessels could not be spared. The cormorant class is an example of this type of ship-sloop. So a smaller, like a mini frigate almost, you would say, because it's a full square-railed three-masted vessel, but a small one. The more common type was the brig-sloop, which was a two-masted ship, brig-rigged, and the cruiser class were of this class. The Sappho was a cruiser class. So ship-sloops, and sometimes this actually shows up. I've seen them, the cruiser class, being stated as being ship-sloops, but they were brig-sloops. They were two-masted vessels. HMS Sappho, which we met in the opening, was of this class, as I mentioned, the cruiser class brig-sloop. And approximately 110 were ordered between 1797 and 1808, making it one of the most numerous single warship classes of the period. Their standard armament was 16 32-pounder carronades and 2 6-pounder long guns, and were rated at 18 guns, with a crews of around 120 men. The 32-pounder carronade gave them a short-range broadside weight of 262 pounds per side, that exceeded the nominal broadside of a standard 36-gun 18-pounder frigate. The trade-off was range. Carronades were short-range weapons. Not super short-range, mind you, but shorter range. The schooner was a fore and aft vessel with shallow draft and useful in confined waters, and fast in light winds. Many were purchased from the merchant market or taken as prizes. The cutter was single-masted and heavily canvassed, well suited to the Channel and the North Sea. The Revenue Service had developed the type extensively before the Navy adopted it in larger numbers during the Revolutionary Wars. Fast on the reach, effective for dispatch work, inshore patrol, and anti-privateer duties. The gun-brig, and I've mentioned that quite a bit in my gun-brig video about the Archer class, I'll link it here, was a shallow draught brig carrying heavy guns relative to its size. Mostly effective in coastal water. They did sail the globe, but did they have some difficulty in seas and any sustained blow. Contemporary officers were not generally enthusiastic about serving in them. The bomb vessel was purpose-built to carry 1 or 2 heavy mortars, commonly of 10 or maybe 13-inch caliber. Hulls were structurally reinforced to absorb recoil from high-angle fire. Slow and not suited to maneuver, but quite capable of sustained shore bombardment at angles no other vessels could achieve, as I mentioned. Lord Cochrane, commanding a 14-gun brig sloop HMS Speedy from 1800, described her as a little more than burlesque of a vessel of war. His cabin had 5 feet of headroom. He reportedly shaved by putting his head through the skylight, keeping his soap and water on the quarterdeck above. Cochrane's memoirs are self-dramatizing, but the central details here are consistent with the record dimensions of the vessel. So in this case it might be true. The Royal Navy did not formally adopt the term corvette, as I mentioned earlier, until in the 1830s, but they did have some vessels like these post ships of that size, so I would like to mention that as well. Sloops and post ships were of that size sometimes. The French used corvette for their own vessels of this size, typically from 16 to 24 guns, and the term is accurate in that context. Sometimes you get the term flute, and I think mostly this would refer to a vessel, not a vessel class, but a configuration at this time. There was an earlier flute, typically Dutch ship, but at this time would be a warship, usually a frigate, temporarily disarmed to increase cargo capacity or troop capacity. It's not a distinct ship type, but a state. It's like a ship state, and flute. So you would disarm a vessel to make it carry more troops or goods. Britain's war effort depended heavily on maritime commerce. Baltic timber and naval stores, West India produce, East India Company trade, and Atlantic and Mediterranean mercantile routes. Convoy legislation required most merchant shipping to sail under naval escort. Large convoys could number into the hundreds, in some cases over 200 vessels even. Escorted convoys demonstrably suffered lower capture rates than independent sailings, though the precise figures varied by route and year. Unrated vessels formed a substantial portion of the escort force on secondary routes, where committing frigates or ships of the line was impracticable. The Sappho action is a direct illustration on how convoy protection worked in this practice. She was not assigned to escort those specific merchant vessels. She was on patrol in an area where merchant traffic was known to be at risk. She intercepted a threat that was already in the process of attacking British commerce. That was their job. Also, of course, inshore blockade. The close blockade of the French port Brest, Orsho, Lorient required vessels capable of operating in shoal water near hostile coast that frigates could not safely enter. Ships of the line maintained the offshore presence, frigates cruised in support, smaller vessels held the inshore watch when the larger vessels had withdrawn in bad weather. Contemporary correspondence from senior officers indicate that inshore commands require essentially continuous vigilance. Vice Admiral Collingwood, writing to Vice Admiral Cornwallis about HMS Pickle before Trafalgar, observed that her commander can never be in bed during the night. This was a general assessment of the inshore service, not a remark about one individual. Another use of this vessel was, of course, dispatch and communications. Before the telegraphic infrastructure, naval communication moved physically by sea. Orders, intelligence, and operational reports were carried by fast small vessels, schooners, brigs, and cutters. After Trafalgar, on October 21st, 1805, Vice Admiral Collingwood dispatched HMS Pickle, a Bermuda-built schooner of approximately 127 tons, to carry the Victory dispatches to Britain. Pickle sailed on the 26th of October, reached Falmouth on the 4th of November, and arrived at the Admiralty, and the captain arrived at the Admiralty 1 a.m. on the 6th of November after a 271-mile post-chase journey, changing horses, possibly, this might be an overclaim, 21 times. His expense claim, £46, 19 shillings and 1 penny, and survives in the Admiralty records. He reported to William Marsden, First Secretary of the Admiralty, "Sir, we have gained a victory, great victory, but we have lost Lord Nelson." So the French side of this then, French guerre de corse. Commerce raiding formed part of the French naval practice from the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars in 1793. After major fleet losses at the Nile in 1798 and at Trafalgar in 1805, the French capacity for sustained fleet confrontation diminished and increased the relative importance of commercial warfare. French corvettes, frigates, and privateers operated in the Atlantic, the Channel approaches, and the Indian Ocean. The French Navy used corvettes both as independent raiders and in conjunction with larger frigates for also larger offensive operations. In February 1804, a French squadron under Rear Admiral Lenoir with the 74-gun Marengo and the frigates Bellepoule and Semillante also had a corvette Berceau, and they intercepted a British East India Company convoy near Aura in the Strait of Malacca. The convoy compromised approximately 16 to 20 Indiamen and additional merchant vessels. Through disciplined information and sustained bluff by the convoy's commanders, the attack was deterred. Lenoir withdrew without prizes. This is also, if you read Aubrey Maturin, this is described as Aubrey being part of that convoy of Indiamen and being the idea for this whole defense. And these ships are also mentioned in those books. The episode illustrates both the operational reach of French small vessel forces and the effectiveness of organized convoys when well managed. The French also used corvettes for dispatch work and to supply overseas garrisons, a direct parallel to the British practice. British unrated vessels were used specifically to interdict these supply lines. Also, the French had, as the British, a number of different types of brigs, of course, like two-masted, brig-rigged vessels that carried out most of the similar roles as those larger corvettes, but with lesser armament. Another important side to this was the privateers. A privateer was a privately owned armed vessel operating under government letter of marque, authorized to capture enemy merchant ships as a prize. It was a recognized instrument of war used by both sides, also heavily by the Americans in their wars. France employed privateers extensively from Saint-Malo, Dunkirk and beyond, and from Mauritius and Réunion in the Indian Ocean. So this is another one mentioned by the Aubrey Maturin series. The Admiral Yule, which HMS Sappho intercepted at Scarborough, was operating under Danish letters of marque, Denmark having allied with France after the British bombardment of Copenhagen in 1807. Jorgensen's account of cutting through the ice a month early to catch British traders unaware is a useful illustration of how privateer operations worked in practice. Calculated risk, local knowledge, and speed before a naval response could be organized. Robert Surcouf, operating largely from Mauritius, captured several East Indiamen, including the Triton in January 1796 and the Kent on 7th of October 1800. Kent was notable because she was armed and was carrying troops. Surcouf retired from active sea command around 1808, maybe later, and died in Saint-Malo 1827, showing that sometimes these privateer captains could actually be quite successful. Our latest battle, that might not become a battle report, we actually tried another engagement with the Phoenix, an East Indiaman, fighting off a French privateer vessel, the Malatique. The problem with this is that we're not really sure if we're going to be able to use it, because I was using a new tool to try the filming, and the filming turned out horrible. So there might not be a battle report, but we did try it though, using the B2 quarter rule set, and there's an update for B2 quarters where you can reflect it being a merchant vessel as well. So please take a look. I'm putting a link to that right here. Britain also issued letters of marque, and the British privateers were active in the Caribbean and Atlantic. Britain's strategic priority, however, was protecting its own commerce rather than disrupting French trade, whose overseas volume was significantly smaller. Counter-privateer patrol fell largely to unrated British vessels, cutters, gun-brigs, brig-sloops operating in the Channel, the North Sea, the western approaches. HMS Sappho's action on 2nd of March 1808 is a routine example of that work. Another action was the action, and this has been, I'm not going to go too deep into this, because we have this really well done description of this by Dirk Innefeld on his channel, where he was friendly enough to use my models of the two ships that I made for the diorama. So I'm going to link that here, but I want to mention it as well because it is one of those smaller brig actions. So the action was between HMS Speedy and El Gamo. And El Gamo, I have some different, I mean, she's known as a Sebec frigate, Sebec hull, square-rigged frigate, but in some cases she's also more looking like a corvette, like a Sebec hulled corvette. Like the ornament wasn't as large as in some places. So, but it's open to interpretation, of course. And it's documented in Admiralty records, this fight, also prize court proceedings and James's naval history. Of course, Cochrane's memoirs also mention this. Cochrane's autobiography is, of course, a little bit self-dramatizing in its tone, but the central fact can be somewhat corroborated independently. Speedy had 14 guns, and these were mainly 4-pounders, and also some swivels. Her broadside weight was 28 pounds, and she had a crew of 54, and that was mostly because of the fact that she had sent away several prize crews. So her crew was even smaller than it would normally be. El Gamo, possibly 32 guns, 8 and 12-pounder long guns, or maybe, I'm not sure about the ornament here. I mean, different sources say different things, but mostly she had 8 or 12-pounder long gun armament. She might have carried some 24-pounder obusiers like a cornets. Crew of 319 men, and if we're going to trust the larger broadside weight, approximately 190 pounds. Cochrane had taken command of Speedy in March of 1800, as I mentioned earlier, and in 13 months the ship captured and destroyed over 50 vessels, took 534 prisoners, and seized 122 guns, operating primarily along the Spanish coast. On this morning, on this day of 6th of May 1801, Speedy sighted El Gamo off the coast of Barcelona and approached under American colors to close the range. When the British ensign went up, El Gamo fired a broadside that did not connect. The relative possessions meant her guns could not be depressed sufficiently to bear on the smaller vessel alongside. And according to some sources, this is something that Cochrane actually planned. He had noted this in advance. Speedy's guns had been elevated on wooden blocks to fire upward into El Gamo's hull. The first British broadside double-shotted killed El Gamo's captain and the boatswain. 3 Spanish boarding attempts were broken up in the same way. Cochrane then boarded El Gamo himself by splitting his crew into 2 parts and also leaving the ship's surgeon as the sole man remaining on Speedy. The British casualties were 3 killed and 9 wounded, the Spanish 14 killed and 41 wounded. So the total Spanish casualties were actually more than Speedy's total crew complement at this point. El Gamo was sailed to Port Mahon as a prize. Cochrane requested promotion for his first lieutenant William Parker. The admiral then declined this on the grounds that it was not a rated ship he had taken. So Gamo didn't count as a rated ship. It was under a letter of marque, if I remember it right. The engagement remains one of the most asymmetrical small ship actions of the period, though, so it needs to be mentioned here in this video, I think. Another type was, of course, these bomb vessels. At Copenhagen in September 1807, the strategic objective was to prevent the Danish fleet falling under French control, following Napoleon's alliance with Denmark after Tilsit. The operation required shore bombardment of a fortified city, a task that ships of the line would be hard-pressed to perform, would be very risky. HMS Thunder, HMS Vesuvius, HMS Athena, and HMS Zebra, if I've read this right, conducted a principal bombardment over several nights. Several ships of the line provided offshore cover to enforce the blockade, and of course frigates were also present. The Danish fleet subsequently capitulated and was taken into British service or custody. The operation was only possible because of the bomb vessels. No rated ships participated in this direct bombardment. So it's an illustration of how these bomb vessels could achieve something that nothing rating hierarchy above could replicate. So purpose-built vessels. And it's also counted among these unrated vessels. So needs to be mentioned. Economic and strategic effects. The French privateering and commerce raiding did not collapse British trade, which in aggregate expanded during much of the war. However, this disruption was real and measurable. Insurance premiums rose sharply during the period of intense raiding activity. Parliamentary debates across the war period reflect sustained merchant concern regarding convoy provision and the allocation of naval escorts. The Commerce War imposed continuous operational demands on the British naval resources: escort duty, patrol, staging of small vessels across multiple theaters simultaneously. The strategic logic of the French Garde Corps was rational given the circumstances. France could not engage the Royal Navy in fleet action on equal terms after 1805. Attacking British commerce was the available alternative. That this did not ultimately succeed does not mean that it was without effect. It required a large and continuous British effort to contain. So in conclusion, between 1793 and 1815, Britain fought more or less, there was a near continuous war, the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, for 22 years there. The dramatic fleet engagements that dominate the visual narrative and memory was because they were concentrated, they were in many cases decisive and well documented. The work of unrated vessels was dispersed, repetitive, and in the normal case rarely commemorated, unless in these more special cases. So in terms of daily operational activity, convoy escort, inshore surveillance, dispatch carrying, anti-privateer patrol, coastal support, and shore bombardment, unrated vessels occupied a substantial and measurable proportion of the Navy's total effort. And in the March 1808 affair of Scarborough, or the single ship action between the HMS Sappho and the Danish privateer, where it spent 30 minutes stopping the privateer that had already taken 8 or 9 British merchant vessels, was of course commemorated in painting. It was a memorable action, but it's an example of those smaller actions, and in many cases which, when successful, led to the commander of the ship in question being posted. So this is a shorter version of a video, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what the other Navy looked like the unrated Navy. And of course, there were so many ships, like of the cruiser class, for instance, these brig-sloops. There was around 110 built. There were very numerous vessels. So that is all for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, I don't have the skills of some of the better channels, but I have the interest. I'm going to keep doing these videos because I really love doing them. And I love sharing this stuff with you. As I said, the battle report might not become a battle report, the last one, since the video footage is deplorable. I am in the end stages of building my Santa Ana, second version of the Santa Ana. Quite pleased with that, and I'm a little bit into a second lively build here. And after I finish those off, hopefully I'm going to be starting, I'm going to do some ships for my fleet, the Endymion and so on, but also I'll be doing a couple of more dioramas actually. So that's going to be in the coming months here. Me doing a lot of dioramas and exploring that and sharing what I find out and my experiences on that with you guys. But until then, I wish you fair winds and following seas.